Hello, my name is Father Mark Bosco, a Jesuit and the Vice President for Mission and Ministry here at Georgetown University. I want to offer you my prayers and best wishes as you enter into the high holy days of the Jewish faith. May this time of fasting and prayer and reflection truly be a gracious time for you. So to all my Jewish brothers and sisters, have an easy fast.
Shana Tova. I'm Bruce Hoffman, a professor in the School of Foreign Service and director of its Center for Jewish Civilization. I also teach in the Security Studies program. Today, I'd like to share with you an essay I wrote for the distinguished German language Jewish journal, Aufbau, for their special issue titled, My Life, My Beliefs. As you may know, Aufbau regularly published contributions from Albert Einstein, Hannah Arendt, Thomas Mann, and my mentor and old friend, Walter Lacour. I chose to write on the inevitability of change and folly of resisting it. But in the editor's infinite wisdom, they changed the title to Pessimists Live Longer. It is both my honor and privilege to share that with you now. If history teaches us anything, it is that change is inevitable. At this profoundly unsettled time, when most everyone's world, sense of security, and well-being has been turned upside down, our ability to recognize, accept, adapt, and adjust to change is of paramount importance. As the great 19th century German statesman Otto von Bismarck observed, man cannot control the current of events. He can only float with them and steer. Our capacity to navigate the myriad of changes occurring today will thus be critical to ensuring our eventual emergence from these ongoing travails. Change can, of course, be good or bad. Advances in medical research and many technological innovations are, of course, positive. Wars, climate degradation, and disease are not. But for many, change does not come easy. It is often more feared than welcomed. Our default preference is the status quo. We generally prefer what we are most familiar with or have comfortably adapted to, and hence are suspicious of the unknown that accompanies most change, with the variety of potentialities for upheaval, disaster, and worse. The renowned British economist, George Maynard Keynes, poignantly warned of the folly of trying to resist change. In his magisterial analysis of the ill-fated Treaty of Versailles, the economic consequences of the peace, Keynes described French minister Georges Clemenceau's futile effort to set the clock back and to undo what since 1870 the progress of Germany had accomplished. As Keynes scathingly observed, this is the policy of an old man whose most vivid impressions and most lively imagination are of the past and not of the future. Commerce also resists change and craves stability. The long run of a bull market is fervently embraced and held on to ever more tightly as its longevity inevitably starts to fade. National economies thus hitch their fortunes to an upward economic cycle and hope against hope that it indefinitely continues. It's thus easy to be lulled into complacency when business is booming, consumer spending is up, popular satisfaction is high, and a desire to resist change firmly takes hold. But that palpably tight grip is usually more tenuous than it may seem. As Carmela Soprano lectured her mobster husband at the start of the 2002 season of the hit television series, The Sopranos, well, let me tell you something, or you can watch the fucking news. Everything comes to an end. The September 11th attacks had occurred only months earlier. They remained an open wound as depicted by the signature Manhattan skyline, featured in the show's opening credits, and from which the iconic Twin Towers were now conspicuously absent. The penalty of becoming too complacent with the world as we might wish it to be, rather than it is, was readily apparent during the period immediately preceding the first systemic change at the start of the present century. Indeed, after the decades of upheaval during the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s, the remainder of the 1990s following the first Gulf War were comparatively calm and placid. Writing in his 2002 book, See No Evil, about the September 11th attacks, the former CIA spy Bob Baer described how a contented, self-satisfied United States had become lazy and complacent during the placid final years of an otherwise tumultuous century, with tragic results. Americans were making too much money to bother. Life was good, Baer explained. Afloat on this sea of self-absorption, the White House and the National Security Council became cathedrals of commerce where the interests of big business outweighed the interests of protecting Americans at home and abroad. Within weeks, however, America was at war in South Asia, and 2 years later in the Middle East as well. A vast new bureaucracy was created to keep the homeland safe from a threat posed by one man and the terrorist organization he led, as opposed to the vast armadas, armies, and air forces that had comprised the security threats posed by actual nation states in the past. Indeed, if terrorists could so threaten the world's lone remaining superpower, many other countries concluded that they were even more vulnerable, resulting in the US-led global war on terror. Terrorism, of course, had changed the course of history at the start of the previous century with the assassination of an Austrian Grand Duke. It had been inconceivable to most that it could or would do so at the dawn of another century. History, of course, never repeats itself exactly, but the inevitability of some change is constant, and we need always to anticipate it. In this context, the words of the recently deceased Israeli scholar of fascism, Zeev Sternhell, ring true. What haunts me is knowing that what exists today, he observed, is liable to fall apart tomorrow. Even in the most desperate straits, people will still resist change and cling to an alternate reality of stability by denial. On March 10th, 1933, for example, Victor Klemperer, the German academician and diarist, similarly lamented that it's astounding how easily everything collapses. Hitler had come to office less than 6 weeks earlier. And as the recent book, Hitler's First 100 Days by historian Peter Fritzsche reminds us, within a very short span of time, a very different and unimaginably harsh new reality had been imposed on Germany. Yet, even with the many dire changes unfolding around him on an almost daily basis, neither Klemperer, nor for that matter, a majority of his fellow German Jews, chose not to leave the familiarity of their cherished homeland for the upheaval of exile, hoping against hope for a return to normality and the status quo ante. Astonishingly, 7 years later, Klemperer records that he was still debating whether or not to emigrate. On the other hand, Conrad Kellen, the Rand Corporation analyst profiled by author Malcolm Gladwell as someone who, if he had been listened to, might have shortened the Vietnam War, presciently fled Germany at the same time that Klemperer was still contemplated the changes wrought by Hitler's ascension to power. As Gladwell recounts, Kellen was 20 when Hitler took over in Germany, and Kellen immediately packed his bags and didn't return until after the war was over. Hitler made it perfectly plain what his attitude towards the Jews was in those years. But most people, Gladwell wrote, didn't listen. Kellen did. That doesn't sound like a great accomplishment, but it was. Kellen clearly accepted the implications of change and was prepared to adapt when the circumstances seemed to him singularly unpropitious. It certainly helped that he was the scion of one of Germany's wealthiest families. Money doubtless facilitates adapting to change. But many other rich Germans believed their money, influence, culture, and even previous war service would still count for something in a world that had rapidly and utterly changed beyond their myopic recognition. The famed historian Walter Laqueur is another example of someone who saw the handwriting on the wall in Nazi Germany clearly and unambiguously. At age 17, a mere 48 hours before Kristallnacht, Lacour bade his parents farewell at the Breslau railway station and embarked on the long journey to British-ruled Palestine and salvation. He never saw his parents again. In the last years of Walter's life, he would often remind me that only pessimists survive the Holocaust. A corollary, perhaps, is that only those who feared change less than death survived that terrible time. As a progeny of the baby boom and child of the Cold War, the world when I was growing up seemed in a state of ongoing, perpetual seismic and systemic change. Presidential assassinations and those of presidential candidates and civil rights leaders, the Cuban Missile Crisis, conscription of young Americans to fight an unpopular war that claimed nearly 60,000 lives, nationwide race riots, and Watergate were the staples of current events before I was even 20 years old. And within the following couple of decades, I saw the hitherto unimaginable happen: the fall of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the end of communist domination in Eastern Europe. Thereafter followed a period of relative quiescence that was indeed shattered by the September 11th attacks. But except for the 2008 economic recession, from which the world mostly recovered fairly quickly, there followed throughout the first 2 decades of the 21st century a remarkably long run of prosperity and good fortune. The shock that has unfolded this past year as the novel coronavirus pandemic upended our lives, wrecked our economy, and balkanized the globe has thus been all the more shocking and profound. What was also hitherto unimaginable quickly became the new normal. We had to adapt to the lockdowns and social distancing, copious washing of hands, and liberal applications of hand sanitizer, and ubiquitous wearing of face masks as an entirely new vocabulary of acronyms like PPE and terms like contact tracing and asymptomatic transmission entered our lexicon. We had to adapt to a new existence where we don't hug or shake hands, only interact virtually over computer screens like today, and generally avoid leaving home. And indeed, all the things we once took for granted, going to work or school in the morning, lunching with friends and colleagues, traveling either on holiday or for business, are now like relics of a past that cannot so easily be recaptured, much less resumed. The coronavirus pandemic has already gravely undermined confidence in leadership worldwide. Some heads of state foolishly believed their countries would be magically spared the ravages of this malady, or they deluded themselves and their fellow citizens with promises of minuscule infection rates, the advent of warm weather, and quack cures. The time lost and opportunities squandered in the months leading up to the coronavirus pandemic thus consigned millions of people to needless suffering and worse. The perils of ignoring expertise and penalties of wishful thinking were laid bare. As the historian Barbara Tuchman warned in her book, The March of Folly, mental standstill or stagnation, the maintenance intact by rulers and policymakers of the ideas they started with, is fertile ground for folly. Rigidifying leads to an increase of investment and the need to protect egos. Policy founded upon error never retreats. The new infections or reinfections in locales across the globe that had recently reopened or were seen to have prudently eased restrictions has further exacerbated these doubts while generating even greater expectation of our elected heads of state to respond to unfolding change, uncertainty, and chaos with knowledge, acuity, expertise, and leadership. Even politicians whose early actions and forthright decisions spared their countries the pain others have suffered have seen reinfection and new coronavirus cases in places like Australia, Israel, and South Korea, among other countries, increase yet again. And they have found themselves scrambling to cope with situations that they had hitherto effectively managed. The one constant we can therefore depend on is that nothing henceforth will be the same as it was. How we adjust and adapt to this new world and existence will present formidable and long-standing rather than ephemeral or episodic challenges. It will necessitate an enormous adjustment of expectations and perhaps drastic reassessments of our lives, lifestyles, behavior, culture. Lacour's admonition about pessimists has relevance again in this context. Indeed, every last vestige of optimism present at the start of the COVID-19 pandemic has been disproven or unrealized. The realists, nay pessimists of the past, the realists, formerly pessimists of today, understand with a depressing clarity that this ordeal will not end until there is an effective vaccine. And even then, it will not end until a sizable population can be vaccinated. They accept that there will in fact be no traditional extended family gathering for Thanksgiving dinners, either in Canada or the United States, come respectively next month in November. There will be likely no big Christmas, Hanukkah, Kwanzaa, and New Year's Eve celebrations across the globe. Easter, Passover, Ramadan, and the Hajj of 2021 may be no different from 2020. The activities that we took for granted, attending concerts and sports events, going out to eat and drink in restaurants and bars, sitting in a classroom or going to the gym, will for a maddeningly indefinite stretch of time remain forbidden. These are the cold realities that nearly a year and a half under the reign of this terrible disease has already taught us. And when an effective vaccine is discovered and the pandemic is tamed, what will our new reality look like? How we continue to adjust and adapt to this situation when the challenges will likely be serious and consequential is imperative. Already, dangerously impacted economies could further atrophy, deteriorate, and perhaps crumble. International commerce could stall. Travel could continue to be impossible. Children will miss schooling and the socialization so critical to their development. Our ability to meet these changes while continuing to change ourselves will be critical. It will need to draw upon reserves of patience and goodwill, fortitude and sound judgment, creativity and vision. Qualities that we once took for granted will both be in short supply and huge demand. Indeed, all this is immensely relevant to the intense focus today on achieving fundamental change in terms of social justice and racial equality in our societies. The ability to transform longstanding prejudice and heal societal divisions will be no less critical and will require similarly exemplary leadership and foresight. Thank you very much.
Shana Tova, everyone. Belated Happy New Year from us in Dharmic Life. I'm here with Brahmachari ji, the director of Dharmic Life, and my name is Jonathan Makransky, the interreligious coordinator here in campus ministry. And so we wanted to wish you a sweet new year following Rosh Hashanah last week. And as we enter into Yom Kippur today, we wanted to wish you an easy fast as we enter this period of reflection on the past year and considering the person we would like to be in the coming year. And I will turn it over to Brahmachari ji.
Well, Shana Tova, for the new year that has just gone might be sweet. And as you enter into this reflective period, it struck me about these ancient cultures, about how the old mind used to conceive of the universe. And the Jain tradition has, at exactly this time of year, actually it finished a couple of weeks ago, they have a period of reflection called Paryushan, where they fast for 9 days. And the culmination day is a day where they ask for forgiveness. And they say something called Michami Dukkadam, which translates to, I ask pardon of all living beings. May all living beings forgive me. May I have friendship with all beings, and may I have enmity with no one. And so I offer that to you as my reflection, and in the hope that it also supports you as you go through this period of reflection on Yom Kippur.
Thank you, Brahmachari. And I will just offer a very brief meditative moment here, if you will, for us to set our intentions for the coming year. So take just a minute to allow your consciousness to sink gently into your body and just fully be present in your body here in this moment. Just letting yourself be fully present. And when you're ready, you can also turn to gently focus your attention on your breath, just feeling the way it flows in and out, revitalizing yourself, giving you the energy for the coming year ahead. And we can think to ourselves, who is the person I would like to be in the coming year? What qualities do I want to bring to my relationships? And how will I be fully present to others in those relationships? And we can take this practice with us as we continue through the day today and into the coming year, and have it be our dedication guiding us as we move through the rest of the semester and the coming year together. Thank you all very much. And we wish you an easy fast for the rest of the day. And we look forward to connecting with you again soon.
Good Yontif. My name is Ira Forman, and I teach at the Center for Jewish Civilization at Georgetown University. I'm here today with this presentation because I had the great fortune of spending 4 years from 2013 to 2017 as the special envoy to monitor and combat anti-Semitism at the U.S. State Department. So I'm going to talk about anti-Semitism today and what I learned from those 4 years and the subsequent teaching and continued research on anti-Semitism. And I want to talk essentially about 4 topics. Number one, how bad is anti-Semitism today? How do we evaluate its impact? Secondly, I want to talk a bunch about what types of anti-Semitism, and particularly the complexity of anti-Semitism today. 3, what can be done to combat anti-Semitism? And finally, 4, what can you do about it? So let's start out with evaluation, or how bad anti-Semitism, resurgent anti-Semitism in 2020 is. So oftentimes when I speak about this topic, people ask me, are we literally reliving the 1930s, the decade in the run-up to the Holocaust? And my short answer really is no. Mark Twain supposedly once said, history rarely repeats itself, but sometimes it rhymes. I think it is rhyming, but it's not exactly repeating itself. And there are some major differences today with the exterminationist anti-Semitism that we saw develop in the 1930s. First, Jews in the 1930s had nowhere to go. You were in occupied or potentially a dangerous part of Europe. You couldn't really go to someplace else. Today, that's different. Primarily, there's a state of Israel for Jews can get to and can be welcomed in. But there are other countries periodically, too, that open up their doors. Secondly, in the 1930s, we had a form of anti-Semitism which the government was perpetrating. And since states in civilization supposedly have a monopoly on violence, state-sponsored anti-Semitism is particularly problematic. So those are the difference. But what I want to make a caveat is this is what we see today. No one can really predict far into the future. We don't know what's going to happen in 10 years. But even looking at today, if this is not the 1930s, what is it? Well, I think it's may not be exterminationist anti-Semitism today, but we really risk the end of certain smaller Jewish diaspora communities. For example, there is talk in some countries of Europe about ending circumcision. And the vast majority of Jews today practice male circumcision. And if you eliminate that, especially with a small community, it's highly likely that that community will diminish, leave to the point where it essentially collapses. Now, this is not the tragedy of elimination and mass death. And by the way, I think because of violence, we will see some more killing of Jews around the world, perhaps in the United States, but certainly in Europe. But beyond that, the problem is that these communities that we're talking about, some of them are 2,500 years old in places like Asia Minor or Turkey. And even the younger ones are hundreds and hundreds of years old. And this would be a great loss, not just to these small Jewish communities, but frankly, to the countries that host them or their home countries. They will become more unitary cultural instead of multicultural, and they will be weaker. So that's what we think the stakes are today. So let's move on to how it manifests itself. How do we see it, and what is the complexity? I think the one thing I found in my 4 years at the State Department that really surprised me is how complex modern anti-Semitism is. Let me give you an example. One of the great triumphs of human rights was the ability to get Russian or Soviet Jews out of one of the two superpowers, the Soviet Union. And when this effort started to take place of trying to get Jews out of the Soviet Union, most people thought, oh, this is an impossible task. Soviets generally don't let ethnic groups out. Certainly, Jews are very highly educated. They're valued at some point, even though they're discriminated against in many, many ways. And the Soviets are just not going to do this. But over the course of 30 years, almost a miracle happened, and the Jews of the Soviet Union got out, even before the demise of the Soviet system. Now, as difficult as it was to free Soviet Jewry, what we face today, I think, is a lot more difficult. Let me give you some examples. In the Soviet Union, one had to really go to just one address to deal with anti-Semitism. That address was the Kremlin. If you got the Politburo of the Soviet Union to decide, yeah, we'll let go of the Jews, that would happen. Today, we only have, not only do we have not one address, we have multiple countries, dozens of countries instead of one. And I can't tell you in any single one of those countries, one address to go to. There are multiple addresses to go in each of these countries, and different ones to deal with today's anti-Semitism. Let me give you another example. The European Union has an agency called FRA, the Fundamental Rights Agency. And FRA, over the last decade, has done a number of surveys, 2 surveys, on how Jews in European Union countries look at and experience anti-Semitism. And one of the questions I think the most interesting to me is they're asked, have you considered leaving your home country because of anti-Semitism? And the answer in 2012 was about 28%. It's a little higher in 2018 when the survey was redone. But one of the things it found was that anti-Semitism in Hungary was such that 48% of Hungarian Jews said, yes, I've considered leaving over the last 5 years because of anti-Semitism. In France, the number was 46%. Now, if you didn't know any better, you might say, oh, well, anti-Semitism in France and Hungary must be the same. And frankly, nothing could be further from the truth. In Hungary, Jews face one type of anti-Semitism, essentially. Nationalistic, xenophobic anti-Semitism, the type of anti-Semitism that eventually resulted in Nazi Germany. Also, Hungarian Jews face government-sponsored anti-Semitism at times. Now, the government is not anti-Semitic like the pre-World War II Hungarian government was, or even certainly not like Nazi Germany. It only uses anti-Semitism generally when it's useful for them, and it's usually subtle or dog whistle anti-Semitism. When it's politically useful, they use it. But there is no violence against Jews in Hungary, at least not today. In France, there's not just one form of anti-Semitism, there's multiple forms. There's the right-wing xenophobic form. There's the extreme left-wing form, which usually is associated with anti-colonial movements or anti-capitalist movements, anti-globalism. And then there is a anti-Semitism where a small minority of French Muslims are willing to perpetrate violence against Jews. And you do have worries about violence in France, and increasingly not necessarily just from that small minority of Muslims. So without giving you more facts and figures, I'm just going to tell you a story that I think represents what France has been facing, French Jews, but it has some larger points that we can use in understanding what's going on worldwide. So in 2014, there was the war in Gaza. And some of you may remember there were riots and demonstrations in various European capitals and large cities. Sometimes after those riots or demonstrations, Jews were attacked on the street. Jewish synagogues and other institutions were attacked, and even in some cases firebombed or attempted to be firebombed. Jewish businesses were firebombed. And in the wake of those weeks of attack in France, but also in other parts of Western and Northern Europe, you had these newspaper articles talking about whether, speculating about Jews leaving France, largely going to Israel, but possibly going to places like French-speaking Quebec or the United States, and getting out because of anti-Semitism. And I had the opportunity the month after these demonstrations in September of 2014 to visit France, to meet with leaders of the French Jewish community. This meeting was set up by our US Embassy. And when we had a very nice lunch and we were all done, I asked the first question, and I said to it's about a dozen French leaders of the Jewish community, so what's going to happen? Are French Jews going to leave France? And a young man who represented at the time what the Volunteers French Security Organization, Jewish French Security Organization, called SPCJ, he got up and said, everybody I know, literally everybody, young or old, are talking about leaving. But ultimately, even if things don't get better, even if things get worse, the vast majority of us won't. It is simply too hard to leave your family, your friends, your culture, your language, your country, your profession. Most of us won't leave. He said, but that's not the end of the story, because we as a community will have tremendous problems. First, we won't be able to raise any money. Who wants to give, for example, money to a Jewish day school for a community which many people think is dying? Secondly, many of us who our Judaism is not absolutely essential to who we are, will just abandon Judaism. Why be identified as Jewish when it means when your kids go to public school, they get harassed or even beaten up? If you send them to a Jewish day school, they live under the threat of terrorism. In 2012, 3 little French children, Jewish French children, were killed in Toulouse, shot point blank in the head by a terrorist. So he said, 1/3 of us now go to Catholic schools because 1/3 of French Jews feel it's the best option for their children. And he then went on to say, you know, it's really not our government that the problem is. The government has been great. And I can actually testify seeing a lot of that and how the government tried to work with the Jewish community in France. But he then said, but the government's not enough. It's civil society. It's everybody else. Will French citizenry support us as a community? He said, I really don't know the answer. But then he ended by saying, but ultimately, this is not about us. We may be the first to experience this discrimination, this bigotry, this violence, but we won't be the last. This is not about us. It's about the very values of the French Republic. And I don't think I can tell you any facts and figures that tell you what's at stake here better than that. So what can be done? Well, there are, at least before the pandemic, there were multiple, almost every year, conferences about worldwide anti-Semitism and what can be done. And at every conference, one of the things we all knew is there are no silver bullets. There is no surefire way to combat this stuff. There's just too many unknowns. Everybody agrees that security is absolutely essential. Jewish communities in many places are being bankrupted by having to pay for so much security. Just this week, there's a big to-do in Holland over the Jewish community having to pay so much for their own security, especially for their schools in particular. But security, whether it's paid for by the community or the government or some combination, absolutely essential as it is, doesn't solve the problem. It's simply a Band-Aid, an important Band-Aid, but doesn't deal with the ultimate problem of anti-Semitism. So everybody else talks about, of course, not everybody else, but everybody also talks about education, particularly education of young people. That too has its problems. We believe it is true, but one of the things we don't know is what type of education is most effective. I can tell you that just teaching the Holocaust as history may or actually may not have any impact of anti-Semitism. It may have other positive results, but it often doesn't really have anything to do with changing anti-Semitism, especially among young people. It doesn't relate to their own lives, which you can do within some types of educational settings. But we still don't know how to spend the money wisely. And then everybody talks about social media, how the rise of social media has made it so much easier for the bigots to reach large audiences. And what can we do to tamp that down? And it's not just by government censoring the social media or maybe even self-censorship, although self-censorship, what we would call terms of service, every platform you go on has a terms of service you have to live up to, is one part of the answer. I also believe that strengthening civil society at the local level. What do I mean by that? When bigotry raises its head, when institutions like churches, like nonprofits, charities, foundations, civic organizations, business leaders, and yes, not really formally part of civil society, but elected leaders at the local level, all band together to call out the bigots, make it clear that the bigots are not welcome in that community. And in fact, these perpetrators are ostracized, and the people who are being discriminated against, in this case, anti-Semitism, a Jewish community, are welcomed by the community. That type of social ostracism has worked effectively. I'd ask you to look at what happened in the 90s in Billings, Montana, when a Jewish home was battered and how the community came together spontaneously. So the question then is, and the final question I'd say is, what can you do? And almost every audience I speak to, if I don't address it in my remarks, will ask me, so what can we do? And that may seem very daunting. But again, I'll go back to the Soviet Jewry movement. It started in the early 60s, not by governments, not by nonprofits, Jewish organizations like ADL or AJC, who eventually got very involved, but by citizens activists. In Cleveland, Ohio, a group of scientists had a study group and were increasingly alarmed about what is happening to the Jewish community in the Soviet Union. And they began themselves to organize, to influence nonprofits, to influence the government. And they were joined by student leaders in New York. And that was really the beginning, not governments, not NGOs. So there are things you can do. You can also obviously look at career choices, whether working for the government in some of these things, or on the Hill, and not in the executive branch or the Hill, working for NGOs, supporting NGOs are all important. But don't believe that you as an individual citizen don't have some actually real power. Now, there's a conundrum here. There was an interesting program I listened to on NPR a month or two back about climate change. And a longtime climate activist said, you know, what the problem is, each one of us, when we look at a vast problem like climate change, understand that no matter what we do, we have essentially no control over whether we're going to deal with climate change. But if thousands and millions of citizens decide they're going to do something, they collectively have tremendous power. And I think this is relevant here. So let me just end by saying something that may sound pessimistic, but it's not, it's just realistic. We are not in the business, we're fighting anti-Semitism, of ending anti-Semitism. It is not going to happen. Not in my lifetime, not in your lifetime, not in your great-great-grandchildren's lifetime. Anti-Semitism has been with us for at least 2,000 years, probably longer. And it's certainly going to be here for centuries to come. But if we can't end anti-Semitism, we can turn it down. I like to use the metaphor of a faucet. We can't turn the faucet off. We can turn it down. After World War II, that's what's happening. Unfortunately, it's begun to turn back up. We have to reverse it. So let me just say today that it is not something that my generation is going to accomplish in turning it back down. It's your generation. Let me end by saying, repeating a story, I'll paraphrase it, about a Hasidic master who said, we are expected when we pray during the high holidays to pray as if the future totally was up to God. Whether we live or die is up to God. Whether we have climate change, et cetera, it's up to God. And that's what we're supposed to pray for. But when we're done praying, we're expected to act. And we're supposed to act as if we believe that the future totally depends on what we do and what our actions are. Kumar Khatima Tova, may you be inscribed for the good in the book of life. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. I wanted to wish you a very, very happy new year. My name is Michelle Siemietkowski. I'm one of the Catholic chaplains here in campus ministry at Georgetown. And it's truly my honor to wish you a happy, happy new year. In fact, I may have met many of you if you were at the Jewish Life Retreat last fall at the CCC. I was there as well, and it was such a joy to be there with you. I would like to begin first with a thank you. I don't know if you realize what a gift you all are to me and to Georgetown, so I wanted to take this opportunity to let you know. Thank you for your faithfulness. When I've come to Gaston Hall over the years to celebrate the High Holy Days with you, I've been so moved by your faithfulness, as well as when I come to Macomb for Shabbat. I have consistently felt so moved and inspired by your faithfulness and hospitality, and of course by Rabbi Rachel's warmth and her leadership and her beautiful voice lifting us all in song. I can feel your faith when I come to services. I sense your strength. I marvel at your fortitude that's passed down to you through the generations of families and communities. I see in your traditions the joy that you have for being together and sharing your faith. Thank you. I have so much to learn from you. Thank you for being a bright light shining in my heart and at Georgetown. I also would like to thank you for your kindness and your hospitality. I wanted to share a story with you. Once when I came to Macomb for Shabbat, I remember sitting next to someone who just was so kind to me. He welcomed me as if I was part of the family and part of the community. And he might have been able to sense that I was a little nervous because I didn't know all the prayers, being that I'm not Jewish. But he kindly smiled and during the service pointed to where you were and where we were, and I was able to follow along. I'll never forget that gesture of warmth and hospitality and kindness because you really made me feel like I belonged. As I've been reflecting on Rosh Hashanah and what it means, in particular this year, to be welcoming in a new year, and I think about the words Happy New Year, and I'm mindful that there's so much around us in our world right now, and perhaps even in our hearts, that are not happy. So I was asking myself, how do I really say Happy New Year? And I'm convinced that something new and indeed happy is emerging. A new way of seeing things all around us, a new way of looking at our friends and family members, a new way of looking at nature. Now that I'm home so much, I literally stop during my day and look out the window. I can hear the birds chirping. I can see the leaves on the trees moving and swaying differently, maybe because I just didn't take the time before to notice. So these new ways of seeing the world around me is something that I'm grateful for, and I can tell that I'm being invited into. I find myself appreciating so much more the gifts of the ordinary things in my day, and I'm wondering if this is something that we're all being invited into. And I'm more hopeful. I don't want to look at my reality and our reality right now with a feeling of despair or hopelessness. And instead, I'm convinced that we all are being invited to enter into a new year, a new way of looking at things, a new way of proceeding, indeed with hope and courage and even joy. For me, the new that is emerging is, in fact, this sense of a hope and joy. And in fact, letting go of some of the old ways that I've had in the past, old ways and thoughts that have led me to doubt and to despair. Instead, I'm trying to embrace the new ways of looking at the world around me. You know, I can't change the reality that we live in, and I know none of us can really, but I can and want to see my reality with eyes of hope and joy for the gifts that are right in front of me. The gifts of my family, my friends, my community, the gifts of Georgetown, more time to think and reflect and pray and write, more time to thank God every single day for all of the gifts that I have. And for me, I want you to know that you are part of those gifts to me. You are part of this Georgetown community that I'm so grateful for. And so I wanted to reiterate my sincere thanks. And so, my dear brothers and sisters, my friends, I pray that your year may be full of happiness, new ways of finding peace, joy, and love. And may you go from strength to strength. Happy, happy New Year.
Shana Tova, everyone. My name is David Ebenbach, and I'm a professor in the Center for Jewish Civilization and the Learning, Design, and Technology Master's Program. And I also work at Candles, which is our Center for Teaching and Learning on campus, that same center that tried to get all the professors ready for online teaching this fall. I hope you're all having a meaningful Yom Kippur. I know it's not the Yom Kippur that any of us were picturing last year at this time. It's a day when we're meant to strip away comforts, comfortable shoes, comfortable clothes. But of course, many comforts have already been stripped away because of the many things going on in the world and that have been going on in the world for a long time. So it's a vulnerable difficult time. And I guess my wish for you is that the vulnerability that you're likely feeling, along with all of the challenges that I know that you're facing and that we're facing, I hope that vulnerability leaves you at least open to discovery and insight and growth. This Yom Kippur, which is of course a holiday about repentance, I'm thinking about one of the oldest stories from our tradition to think about wrongdoing, the story of Cain and Abel, the story, in fact, of Cain slaying his brother Abel, which makes him, according to the story, the world's first murderer. But was he, and this is what I want to ask in this talk, is was he actually guilty? And what I'm going to argue is that, in fact, Cain was innocent, but that he was nonetheless responsible for what he did. So you probably know the story, but let's review it all the same. Adam and Eve have two sons. They're kicked out of the Garden of Eden. They come out, they immediately have children. They have two sons, Cain and Abel. Another one comes later. But at first, it's just Cain and Abel. And Cain and Abel both bring offerings to God. And God, for reasons that people have been speculating about for millennia, prefers Abel's gift over Cain's. And Cain is infuriated. I'll actually read you the text so you can hear how that goes. This is in Genesis chapter 4, verse 6, and then we skip over 7. And Cain was very wroth, and his countenance fell. And Cain spoke unto Abel his brother, and it came to pass, when they were in the field, that Cain rose up against Abel his brother, and slew him. And the Lord said unto Cain, Where is Abel thy brother? And Cain said, I know not. Am I my brother's keeper? These are some of the most famous words in the whole Bible. Am I my brother's keeper? And what it looks like when you read this story is that Cain is adding sin upon sin here. So he's already murdered his brother, and then he piles on top of that lying. Doesn't he know where his brother is? His brother is there dead on the ground. And furthermore, as a third sin, he's refusing responsibility for his brother's life. He asks, am I my brother's keeper? But of course, I'm putting that tone of voice into it. You don't see that in the Torah, where tone is not indicated. And I think these questions are potentially more innocent than they appear. Think about this. This is a realization I had one year when I was reading about this Cain and Abel story. Before Cain strikes Abel down, nothing in the world has ever been killed before. Nothing has ever died. So for Cain's entire existence and for his parents' entire existence, death wasn't a thing. His parents couldn't have taught him that things could die. He couldn't know that things could die. So in fact, how is he supposed to know as he strikes Abel that Abel can stop living? He did strike his brother, but I think there's no real reason to assume that he meant to kill him, because I don't think he would have even known that it was possible to do that. And so now he's looking at Abel's lifeless body and completely sincerely does not know where Abel, the living Abel, has gone. There's this body, but the living force of Abel is gone, and Cain doesn't know where. So when he's asked where he is, he doesn't know. I think if any of you have ever been to open casket funerals, I have been, there's this very strange experience of looking at this body and recognizing that it isn't the person. The person is gone somewhere. There's this physical matter, but the person is gone. So I don't think Cain is lying in his confusion. I think he's in shock. And I think he's asking a sincere question. And those shocks actually keep coming for him. He's also in shock to learn something about himself. And specifically, that's he has power over something as significant as another person's life and death. So I think he's also sincere with his second question when he asks if he's his brother's keeper. I think he didn't know. I think he means that question in two ways. He means, do I really have power over others of that magnitude? And then tucked in there with that keeper, does having power mean that I'm responsible for others? If you have power, does that mean that you're responsible for others? To be honest, this is actually a pretty fast growth curve. Cain, by my analysis, had no idea any of these things were possible, and pretty quickly he's realizing the power he has, and pretty quickly he's asking himself whether he has more responsibilities than he was willing to acknowledge. So this takes us to a discussion of intentions versus consequences. And what I want to suggest is that, of course, intentions matter. You mean to do something good, that's a good thing. We can all get behind that. Even in this story, we know even though the consequences are quite bad, Cain has killed someone, God actually protects Cain from violence. There's a line in here where Cain is really worried that others will kill him as he wanders the earth. So God marks him and actually promises severe punishment for anyone who would harm him. And the distinction between Cain and those people is that now that murder has been invented, those people would be doing wrong on purpose. They know they can kill, and so if they go ahead and do it, their intentions are bad, and that matters a lot in this divine analysis. So their punishment would be very severe, whereas Cain is wandering but is not marked for that severe punishment to the same extent. That said, regardless of intentions, consequences also matter. I can't get past the fact Cain, I think, didn't mean to take Abel's life. His intentions were not necessarily awful, but the fact is, Abel is now dead. He's not coming back. He's gone forever. It was a mistake, maybe an innocent mistake, but its repercussions are more or less endless and enormous. And meanwhile, Cain is cursed. And what it says in Genesis is he is cursed from the ground, which is to say, it's not that God says, I'm going to curse you now. I'm going to invent a curse and put it on you, and you're going to carry it around. It's more like God is making an observation, saying you're cursed from the ground. In other words, the actions that Cain has taken have cursed him naturally. They're just a natural repercussion of having done something, intentionally or not, really awful. Bad things result. So regardless of his intentions, the consequences are horrific for those who didn't survive and those who did. So in other words, the kind of obvious message here is that all of us, even when we don't mean to do harm, we still can do great harm. The road to hell, as they say, is paved with good intentions. And this is also to say that we have a choice. Are we our brother's keepers? Or siblings' keepers would be better. I think we have a choice that we are either going to be our siblings' keepers, or we are going to be our siblings' abandoners, betrayers, slayers. So what do we do with this? Where do we go with this? Shouldn't it be enough to really mean to do good? Well, I think that's where we start. I think we start with our intentions. Obviously, you want to have good intentions and you want to have intentions at all. So first of all, if you're a person who acts rashly, you've probably seen quite a few consequences radiate out from that in your life. And So if we are folks who behave rashly, we need to make sure we're taking a pause before we do things, especially when other people are involved. And we need to ask ourselves pretty simple questions, simple to ask, harder to answer. What will happen if I do this? What could the consequences be? You can't play them out to infinity. I mean, a butterfly flaps its wings here and there's a hurricane across the world, etc. But I think a little bit of thought can show us that there are some reasonable consequences we could expect sometimes. We can look at what happens when other people do things. We can look at what's happened when we've done things in the past. We probably, with a little bit of thought, can think about what our actions might cause. So that's the first thing. We should have intentions. We should be thoughtful. But even when we have intentions, and even when they're good ones, we ought to think another layer. We ought to think through how we're planning to pursue those good intentions. And also what power we have in the situation. And when you think of those two things together, how we're planning to pursue our intentions and what power we have in the situation, we can think pretty effectively about what effects our pursuits might have. Now, by the way, if you're an overthinker who just usually hesitates to take action, it can sound like, well, maybe I shouldn't do any of this. And in a certain sense, that's true. But I guess I want to point out that inaction can have consequences too. And sometimes thinking too much is just a way to get out of things. We hesitate because, again, of good intentions. We don't want to do any harm, but having that good intention can lead to negative consequences if action is required. And sometimes we must act. So that's what genuine thoughtfulness and not just timidity or anxiety can produce. But it's important to know who you are. Are you somebody who acts rashly? Are you somebody who thinks too much? Who are you? And I think what all this amounts to is if we really have good intentions, genuinely, that means that we have to pursue them thoughtfully. We can't say that we have good intentions if we are not pursuing them thoughtfully. So of course, we will still make mistakes as we pursue this. There are things we don't know or can't foresee, and we will need to correct those mistakes, not just by justifying ourselves. In fact, probably we ought to stay away from that as much as possible, and not by pointing hopefully at our intentions, but by trying to ameliorate the consequences of what we've done. And then by being more thoughtful going forward, both about our intentions, what they are, and how we pursue them. So with that, I'm going to leave you with just a few questions. One, what do you want to try to make happen this year? What are your goals? What are the good things that you want to see happen? And what power do you bring to the situation? What privilege do you have? What advantages do you have? What ability to create effects do you have? And how will you use that power well so that the good intentions lead to good consequences? Shana Tova, may it be a year of genuinely good deeds.
Hello, friends. My name is Reverend Ebony Grissom. I'm the Protestant chaplain here at Georgetown. I am delighted to have just a few minutes with you in this most holy time, in this most holy season. I am wishing you great joy and blessing, shouting a day of blessings. May you have a sweet, sweet, and good year. I'm also thinking of you as you enter the season of Yom Kippur. May you be seated in the book of life. This year is a good one to come to an end, isn't it? I join you in hoping for all the best things to come in the new year, but also remembering God's command so many times, but especially to Joshua, to be strong and courageous. We don't know what lies ahead for us. There might be, I can imagine, some apprehension, excitement for sure, but also just the sort of eek of not knowing exactly what lies ahead. However, remember that God is always, always with you. That God's self has promised that the Lord is with you wherever you go. So, as you enter this new year, be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid, nor be dismayed. For the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. Happy New Year.
Hi, I'm Deborah Tannen. I'm in the linguistics department here at Georgetown. And let me start by saying Yontif. That is the greeting that I heard growing up in Brooklyn. And I want to say also right at the start how grateful I am to Rabbi Rachel for giving me this opportunity to speak to you in connection with the High Holy Days, and for myself to think about what I would say, and therefore think about the High Holy Days myself. I hope you're all doing okay. I know everybody is experiencing some level of anxiety and maybe even depression, and I hope yours is manageable, and that these days of contemplation may actually be helpful in that regard. I also want to say right at the top how grateful I am to have Rabbi Rachel here at Georgetown. This is my 41st year on the faculty here. And so I was here long before she arrived, and I've been here ever since she arrived, and I have definitely experienced and observed with admiration the transformation that Rabbi Rachel has accomplished for the Jewish community here at Georgetown. And so I want to start by thanking Rabbi Rachel for that. This is a time of looking back, taking stock, looking forward, making a path perhaps for our forward path for this year. And so let me tell you just quickly what I'm going to talk about and why. Some of you may know my field is linguistics. I study how people talk to each other. But what I'm talking about today is something that happened very recently that is so important to me personally. Just this month, I have published a book about my father. The book is called Finding My Father, his century-long journey from World War I Warsaw and my quest to follow. In the spirit of thinking about resolutions we made in the past and whether or not we kept them, I made the decision to write this book about my father. I would have to say maybe 40 years ago, maybe exactly when I got my PhD. I actually started very seriously planning to write it in the mid-1990s. And my father knew that I was going to write it, and he was very much in favor of my doing that, and I promised him that I would. My father died 14 years ago, and I promised him again when he was in the hospital, no longer responsive, but the hospice people all assured me that he could hear. And I said, Daddy, I'm going to write the book. Well, it took me 14 years from then and many more years from the time I first decided to write it, but now I have kept that resolution, and that makes me very happy. My father was born in a Hasidic family in Warsaw in 1908. They were part of a very large Hasidic community, and he was raised in that household, a large household. He had no father. His father had died of tuberculosis when he was very young, and so he and his mother and sister lived in a room. They shared one room, in his mother's nuclear family, her parents and her many siblings. She had many siblings. Numbers I have been told range from 16 to 18. My father was told 23 born, 16 lived to adulthood, but there were 9 that lived there when he did, and 13 that I can name and tell you their life stories. So he came from that very large, coherent community that he was a part of in Warsaw and came to this country in 1920. He was 12. I want to talk a little bit about my father as an immigrant. I did not think of him especially as an immigrant when I was a child. Both he and my mother came when they were 11, 12, and so didn't have accents, and they didn't talk about it a whole lot when I was growing up. They talked about it a lot more when they were older. So I want to say a little bit about their experience as immigrants and compare it to immigration today and to each other. And the way that they're coming to this country reflects history in a way that I didn't really understand myself until I decided to and to write this book and started writing this book. So let me start with that comparison. My father, as I said, was born in Warsaw, came to this country with his mother and sister when he was 12. My mother was born in Russia. Well, we always said Russia, but it's Belarus, Minsk. And she came with her mother and 3 siblings. Her father and 3 other siblings had come the year before. The years for all of these events are so significant, again, in ways I didn't understand until I started thinking about it for the book. My father came in 1920. 1920 was the last year there were no limits on immigration from Eastern Europe. All they had to do was get the ticket, get themselves to the city that the boat was going to sail from, get on the boat, and come. Now we all know that there were people did look for this. Let me back up. If you came to Ellis Island, you had to pass a medical inspection. My father did that in Antwerp. He did not go to Ellis Island because he came second class, not steerage. My mother did come to Ellis Island, and she initially tried to come in 1921. That was the year that quotas were first instituted. So I'm going to back up a bit here. Many of you know there was a massive influx. 2 million Jewish immigrants came from Eastern Europe to the United States between 1880 and 1924. So my parents came at the tail end of that massive immigration from Eastern Europe. And I've always really been kind of proud of the fact that I have that direct connection from that great influx of Jews to this country. Most people that I know of my age, it was their grandparents that came, and for many of you, it's probably great-grandparents, great-great-grandparents. But that is the reason that I have that direct connection, because they came as kids and they came right there at the end. It was an era of very similar anti-immigrant sentiment as the era that we are experiencing now. That's why those quotas were instituted in 1921. So my mother's father and 3 siblings had already come, same way, get yourself to the ship, buy a ticket, and come over. But by the time my mother and her mother and the 3 remaining siblings tried to come, actually there was one more older brother who stayed in Russia and sadly was sent to Siberia because he was getting letters from relatives in Russia. That is a whole other story. He did survive Siberia, and he told his family later, an uncle who went and saw him, that the only reason he did not starve to death in Siberia is that other Jews who lived in Siberia passed food to the Jewish prisoners there. It's a side comment on this history. Very similar to what you hear about immigrants today. Her father and brother, who came first, immediately went to work, saved the money that they earned, and sent it back to bring the rest of the family. Because in Russia, it was illegal to leave the country. This was after the Bolshevik Revolution. They had to pay someone to lead them through the woods to Poland. Very much like Mexican immigrants today have to pay a coyote to lead them across the border. The first person that they paid to do this stole the money and disappeared. So her father and brother had to work again, no longer send them the money, and by this time there were quotas. They had to pay a Polish farmer. They climbed into a carriage with a horse-drawn carriage. It was the winter. They apparently couldn't all fit in the carriage. My mother was the youngest, and so she sat the whole way. But her mother walked part of the way, and the story I had always heard was that she lost her shoe in the snow, but there was no possibility of stopping to look for it. They had to keep going, and so she suffered frostbite in her toes. As a kid, I had a lot of scary fantasies about that experience. I knew my grandmother. She lived with us when I was a kid. So they did make it across to Poland, but at this point, you could not just come. They had to wait to get permission to come, and it took 2 years. They came in 1923, another key year, in under the wire, because 1924, the quotas were so draconian. There was a second Immigration Act in 1924 that set the quotas for, in particular, immigrants coming from Southern and Eastern Europe. So it was specifically to stop the Greeks, the Italians, and especially the Jews from coming into the country. And so after 1924, I don't know what would have happened. I think about that so often. Would the family have been permanently separated, with half stuck in Europe and half here? But they came in 1923, and for them it was a happy ending. So just that contrast is so significant and really says something about the effects of these laws on families. One of the key organizations that made it possible for my family to come was HIAS, and I want to say something about that because I know many of you know that Ronit, and we are so sad that she's going to be leaving Georgetown, but so proud that she's going to be joining the team at HIAS. My entire family, my father's side, came to this country because of HIAS. The first of these many siblings, I mentioned my father's mother was one of so many siblings. The oldest one came first and immediately went to work for HIAS as a fundraiser. And that was how he was able to bring all the other brothers, all the other brothers and sisters that came. They were, I think 7 of them came to this country one at a time. The last ones to come were my father and his mother and sister. I actually have papers, and I don't know how my father came to have them. He saved everything, and so I have many, many documents that my father saved, and that was part of the challenge and also the pleasure of writing this book, going through all these documents. I actually have documents that oldest brother had filled out to bring the last two sisters that were left in Poland, and his father. His mother had died by then, and they never came. So the grandfather was a victim of the Holocaust, and one other brother who stayed behind was, but he never sought to bring that brother because that brother had stayed Hasidic and did not want to come to the United States. And I believe the same was true of the grandfather. Did not want to come to the United States because he believed, my father told me, that when Jews came to America, they ceased being Jews because they ceased being Hasidic. And I guess from one point of view, you could say that was true. None of the siblings who came to the United States remained Hasidic, but neither did any of the siblings except that one. And one older sister. All of this is reflective of the era and the history. The oldest sister had remained Hasidic. She was married a man that her father had chosen for her, as my grandmother did, and she died in the 1918 flu epidemic. Let me say that about my grandmother, because that's another aspect of this that I think is really, really interesting. First of all, I mentioned Hayas, that was how they all were able to come over. My grandmother also went to work for Hayas as a fundraiser. My father actually went to work at 14, quit high school, went to work full-time in a factory, which many immigrants did, the garment industry in New York. Many Jewish immigrants found jobs there. And he actually supported his mother and sister. He became the breadwinner of the family by working in a coat factory in the garment district. And I think there, how different that is from opportunities that immigrants have today. Conditions there were terrible. He worked 10-hour days. He would be forced to work Saturday with no extra pay. But he was able to support a family by doing that, starting at the age of 14. And the loss of factory jobs is definitely a change that makes it so much more difficult for immigrant families to survive today. And I should say I'm going to be talking about the book at the CJC tomorrow. I'm going to be saying completely different things. What I'm talking about today is very different. But I will mention that my father though he quit high school, never graduated from high school, nor did my mother. He took high school equivalency tests, passed the law school qualifying exam, went to law school at night, and became a lawyer. That too, I think, would be much harder today than it was then. School would be more expensive, and of course, now you can't go directly from high school to law school, so that makes it harder as well. So I've lost my place here. The situation for immigrants, I want to say something about my grandmother in particular. I told you that she was working as a fundraiser for Hayas after my father got married and could no longer support her. In Warsaw, she was highly educated. She had gone to the equivalent of college. She had founded and was the principal of the first school for Hasidic girls in Warsaw and probably in Poland. Her sisters were all highly educated. One was a physicist and mathematician who had studied with Einstein. One was a dentist. She was actually the first woman dentist in Newark, New Jersey. But in this country, my grandmother never could find work that was that used her education or that was worthy of her, or that she could simply support her family. She tried when she first came working in a bank, but when she refused to work on Saturday, she lost the job. And that's why my father was the one who had to go to work and support the family. And my father also left me journals that he had kept when he was young, and I could see reading the journals that she suffered probably from depression. He describes her as lying in the couch all day, unkempt, her hair unwashed. I mean, it's very sad. It's really a description of someone immobilized by depression. And I really came to understand why she would have felt that way. Her circumstances so reduced from what they were back home. And my father, again, didn't understand this really till I read his journals and talked to him at length after he retired in preparation for writing the book, that he always missed being part of that community that he had been part of in Warsaw, that tight Hasidic community, which he described in great detail. Said you couldn't even step out of the house without running into relatives. And visiting relatives was basically what you did for relaxation. You worked 6 days a week, and on Shabbos you visited relatives. So I guess I want to end there and just talk about how remembering the role of immigration in my history, understanding its role in my father's life, and helping to understand what immigrants today are going through. And I think it is so fitting, and I'm so proud that Ronit is going to work for HIAS, and that HIAS today is working with refugees around the world, because that's where we all come from. Thank you so much. Good Yontif.
Shalom and Shana Tova. My name is Tony Mazurkowitz, and I serve as a chaplain for athletics here at Georgetown. I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to be with you virtually today. And as these high holy days commence, I'd like to wish you, the members of our Jewish community who are celebrating Rosh Hashanah, a blessed, a sweet, and a happy new year. As you enter these days of prayer, of reflection, and celebration, may you experience a depth of renewal and restoration like no other. I am both grateful for and inspired by your commitment to the act of reconciliation during these holy days. And may this sacred commitment bear fruit in your hearts, with your family and your friends, within our communities, and especially in our world, yearning for justice, for peace, for health, and for hope.
Hi, everybody. My name is Maytal Orr, and I'm a professor at the CJC, the Center for Jewish Civilization. And I teach courses on modern Jewish literature and history at the CJC. I teach Introduction to Jewish Civilization, from which I'll draw today. And I also teach Israeli and Palestinian literature and film, which is a class I teach in the spring. And then I also teach intermediate Hebrew, and I coordinate the Hebrew program at the CJC. So that's kind of what I do. I'd love to see any of you at any of those classes if those topics interest you. And today I would like to talk about a theme that I teach about that's connected to Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur is a time of self-reckoning. It's a time of reevaluation, self-reevaluation, I would say. It's a time of teshuvah, right? Or tshuva. Tshuva in Hebrew means an answer. So we are sort of answering ourselves, we start questioning ourselves as well as answering ourselves, and returning to a path that we've strayed from. But it's mostly a time of asking oneself questions, or of self-questioning. And I think that one aspect of this I'd like to kind of expand upon today and sort of enlarge upon and go into is this whole issue of self-questioning, and how much questioning is actually at the core of Jewish history, of Jewish tradition, of Jewish civilization itself. And the way this works is that essentially questioning, right, or interpretation, right, of one's actions or of the text of the Hebrew Bible, right, the Tanakh, and questioning of God as well, are all really, really integral foundational aspects of Jewish civilization, and interesting ones as well. So one of the foundational and historical preoccupations of Jewish civilization, one of its defining traits, is its preoccupation with, or even one might say obsession with, interpretation and questioning, which actually goes to show how liberal it is relative to, I think, other religious traditions. The fact that questioning is vital to the existence of Jewish civilization, right? There's a premise that to understand the text, to understand God, we have to understand interpretation as a biblical commandment, right? So the text, the Hebrew Bible itself, is full of ellipses and repetitions and question marks, and some words we're not sure what they mean, right? Or some sentences seem as if they're missing a word. And what's fascinating is that it's a text that almost invites questioning, right? It invites you to interpret it because it's difficult to interpret, actually. And that's why so many interpretations exist of the biblical texts, because of their invitation to interpret them, both in terms of how their form, as well as because characters in the Bible are constantly questioning and interpreting both their own actions as well as the actions of other biblical characters, right? So, but moreover, even going beyond the structure of the text, right? There's an injunction in a way to, within Jewish civilization, to argue with the text, right? And to argue with God himself, right? One example is, what did Moses say when God says to him, free my people, right? Go and lead them from slavery to freedom. And Moses says, who am I to do this, right? He gives like maybe 5 different reasons why he can't be the one to lead them, right? How could they trust me? I ruled over them, right? I'm just a human being. How can I change Pharaoh's mind? How can I free an entire people? Who am I to do this? I stutter, right? There's all kinds of reasons that he gives. He argues with God. He questions this commandment, this order that's given to him by God. And he argues with God himself, right? So many patriarchs do this. Job does this, right? Job, the most righteous Gentile who ever lived, adopted by Jews, is, right, a role model for what a Jew should be, right? He argues with God. He is the quintessential God arguer, right? But this argumentation that Job engages in, and I'll get into more of Job specifically soon, but the argumentation that he and Moses engage in with God, the questioning of God, right, is not viewed as blasphemy. And that's really one of the main differences between Judaism and Christianity, I would say, that in Christianity, you receive the text, right? The text is given to you and it is God's word, and it's not for you to question it, right? Who are you to question God's word, right? Is the feeling, is the perspective. You are a mere mortal and you cannot possibly understand God's plan. The text was written and you are only to receive it, and arguing with it, right? Or questioning it, or questioning God, arguing with God, accusing God, as Job goes so far as to do, is blasphemy. It's sinful and it's not acceptable in Christian tradition, in most Christian traditions, I would say. And that's a big difference from Jewish tradition. Jewish tradition is inherently quite liberal in the fact that it accepts such questioning as part of its tradition. If there's no received truth, there is a truth that, of course, one must understand the greatness of God and the existence of God in Jewish tradition, but one is always entitled to questioning. In fact, rabbis, what is the Talmud? The Talmud is a constant questioning, a constant preoccupation with questioning. Why? Because once you have the destruction of the Second Temple, you no longer have an ability to be unified as a people in a common geographic area, right? And all you have left is your portable homeland, as Heinrich Heine called the Hebrew Bible. And when that is all you have, and a majority of your scholarly population has been decimated by the Romans, right? And by 73 ACE, what exactly do you have left? You don't have people to tell the stories of the text. You don't have a nation. You're disintegrated. You're scattered you're living in the diaspora for 2,000 years, right? Out of the total of 3,000 years that the Jewish people has existed. And And so at that point, you need to constantly go back to the Hebrew Bible and you need to deal with it. You need to interpret it, right? That's why we have hermeneutics, right? Biblical interpretation, which preoccupies the next 2,000 years essentially of Jewish civilization. And that's why you have the creation of the Talmud itself between about 200 and 600 ACE, after the Christian era. Right, you have scholars and sages understanding that to stay alive, the Jewish nation has to keep its preoccupation with the Hebrew Bible alive, the text that tells their history, that is their narrative, that is their legends, their folklore, their mythology, their history, their religion, their theology. Right, it is also a theological / political document as well in terms of all the major themes that it presents. Right, how the younger son is always chosen above. Right, preferred above the elder son, right? There's the feeling of the Jews that they were a minor player on the international arena and that they could be chosen by God nevertheless, right? That they would win after all against much stronger empires, much larger nations, right? That had political, economic, military strength, right? That the Jews didn't have. And they had to believe that there was a way that through wit, right? Through their minds, through their brains, their right, their intellect, that they could, conquer nevertheless, that they could become God's chosen and could become the owners of his covenant, right? That even that God's covenant could be with a minor nation, because look at all of these younger sons that were chosen above the elder ones. This is a common theme throughout the Hebrew Bible, right? So it is this constant preoccupation with the Hebrew Bible that created the Talmud. And I'd like to share with you sort of how far this interpretation has gone and how much self-questioning, questioning the text and questioning oneself are interrelated. I'd like to share with you a page of Talmud now. If you can see this, a sample page of Talmud. And you can tell that it doesn't look like a normal page, right? There are all sorts of texts in it and surrounding it. And what do these texts actually mean? Why doesn't the page look like a normal page you would read? There are comments in the margins that you see here. Why is a Talmud page actually structured this way? And if we kind of highlight the different parts, we can see that obviously the Hebrew Bible is a book that was written over hundreds of years by hundreds of writers, which is part of the reason why there's so many ellipses and unknowns, unknown words within it and missing words, right? Because so many people took part in it over such a long period of time. But the Talmud is essentially a case study in Jewish hermeneutics and in Jewish biblical interpretation, right? You have the Mishnah, right, which was written in Palestine about 220 CE, right? Within it is a phrase from the Hebrew Bible, but really everything else is interpretations of that phrase or that situation, and then the interpretations of the interpretations, right? Mishnah in 220 CE, the Gemara in 500 CE, right? Comments by Rashi are on every Talmud page, right? The foremost biblical interpreter from northern France in 1000 CE. You have the comments of the Tosafists of France and Germany in the 12th to 13th centuries, and each one is relating not just to the biblical text but to previous interpreters, right? And there's a key to scriptural quotations, right? Cross references to medieval codes of Jewish law, right? And all sorts of little comments of other lesser known rabbis, on the sides. So you see, integral to Jewish tradition and Jewish civilization is interpretation itself, questioning the texts, and yeshivas, right, are filled with people doing this today, right? Talmudic seminaries, right, and yeshivas, and will be forevermore, I believe. This is just so central to Jewish life and questioning why lots of Jews go into law, right? Because it's so inherent in Jewish tradition. To question. And this goes on until today. I'd like to share with you a page of a new modern magazine, which still presents itself in the form of a Talmud page in one section of it. So I'd like to share with you a page of Nishma magazine. Hope you can see it. It's the Nishma page of Shema magazine in June of 2017. And this is thanks to David Ebenbach, Professor Ebenbach, who also teaches at the CJC. and who's the husband of Rabbi Rachel, who pointed this out to me. It's beautifully done. Many waters cannot quench love, neither can the floods drown it. So in the middle, there's a phrase from the Song of Songs. And then on the sides, you have views on this particular phrase by modern thinkers, by artists, by literary critics, by authors, right? And you have two commentaries up here, and then you have another commentary down here, which just goes to show how much this element of interpretation and questioning of the text is still integral to Jewish tradition, and still being carried on today, even in sort of a secular endeavor, inherently speaking, like Shema magazine. And I'd like to share one more thing with you guys today. I'd like to share with you Jewish interpretations of the book of Job. So just real briefly to refresh our memories, Job is the most righteous Gentile who ever lived. And he's sort of the subject of a bet that the adversary, quote unquote, or Hasatan, right? The Jewish Satan, which is nothing like the Christian Satan. And it's actually it's a whole nother topic in its own right, how different the Jewish Satan is. It's more like a legal representative of God. It's more like a fiend or an impish sort of demon. It's not, it's in no way is the Jewish Satan like the romantic conception, Christian conception of Satan as the opposite of God and equal to God in power, but of course evil in his intentions, right? The Jewish Satan is a much more folkloric kind of fiendish imp who sort of makes following the right path, right, enough of a challenge to make it worth conquering the devilish or evil impulses within man. So he's more like a lawyer, right, or a legal representative, an adversary, a legal adversary, right? And he comes to God and he says to God, you know, you boast about how your servant Job is so faithful, right? That he's such a good right Jew, right? No, sorry, a good Gentile, and God says, yes, look at my Job. Look how strong his faith is. And the adversary says, well, you know, his faith is strong because he's got it so good. Look at how well he's doing. He has a large family. His family's healthy. He has a wife. He has so many belongings. His business is going well. Why shouldn't he have faith in you? But why don't you take away everything from Job and then see if he still has faith in you? And of course, God, in a problematic way to some extent, takes the adversary up on this bet and says, well, you know, and the adversary says, take everything away from him and see if he's still as faithful. And God says, okay, and takes everything away from Job. And it's horrific, right? It's horrible. He takes away his children, all his children, his 7 sons and 3 daughters, right? 7 and 3 being symbolic of wholeness and completeness in ancient Near Eastern beliefs, including in the Bible, which has continued up till today, by the way, when you have, you know, 3 little bears and the 3 little pigs and the 7 dwarfs and so on. But everything's complete in Job's life, right? And it is wholesome and is perfect, right? And this is also to signify that we're entering sort of a folkloric realm, a fairy tale realm, that this is indicating to the ancient reader, right, of the book of Job, that this story is not necessarily realistic, right? To suspend belief for a minute. But he loses his 7 sons and his 3 daughters, and he loses his business. He loses all his worldly possessions, and in the end, he even loses his health itself. And he wants to die. He's suffering so much, right? He's lost everything that could make life meaningful, essentially, for a human being. And he wants to die, and he wants to give up his faith in God. His wife says, blaspheme God and die. And he says, no, right? The first thing he does when everything's taken away from him, he begins to worship, which is incredible in itself. And he says, shall we accept only the good from God and not also the bad, right? Which is such a good statement to kind of think about and really, I think, examine more closely also today, right? The pandemic and what we're all going through, right? Can we accept the gift that is life itself, right? So readily, but not also accept the hardships that come with life, such as the pandemic, right? And there have been way worse, right? We're not in the Holocaust. We're not, you know, right? We are undergoing by far what Job has undergone, right? And we're asked to accept the bad along with the good. And Job even says this, despite his loss, right? That's why he's the quintessential right, example of a pious Gentile. And he begins to worship, right? And he says we have to accept everything from God, but he also begins to rail against God. He begins to argue against God in a way that no other character ever does in the Hebrew Bible. And his arguments become pretty extreme, right? So looking at some of his arguments, I'd like to point out to some of the most radical extremes to which he reaches. He does not take his wife's advice, by the way. She says, blaspheme God and die, and he doesn't, right? And the question is, what does that mean to blaspheme God, right? It means to stop believing in God and maybe even to suicide, right? Both of which are sins, right? And unacceptable in Jewish tradition. Suicide, right, is a taking away of one's life, of the gift that God gave one, right, is being taken away. So that's a sin, right? But blaspheming God, she doesn't mean arguing with God, because arguing with God, he does, right? And in the end, he's forgiven and he's actually approved of, right? So arguing with God is not such a terrible sin, right? But to stop believing in God would have been a blaspheme, right? Would have been sinful and sacrilegious, and that he does not do. He does not take her advice, even though he wants to die more than anything, and even though he wants to give up his faith, he never does. But he does go to quite an extreme in terms of his rebellion against God, right? Leads him to say that God is unjust, that God abuses his power and is sadistic, right? He says, if I summoned him and he responded, I do not believe he would lend me his ear, for he crushes me for a hair. He wounds me much for no cause. Though I were blameless, he would prove me crooked. He destroys the blameless and the guilty. When suddenly a scourge brings death, he mocks as the innocent fall. Right? And there's an element even of accusing God, of going beyond, right? Not just saying that God is unjust or that God abuses his power, but that God is even sadistic, that he gains pleasure from inflicting pain on the innocent, right? This is quite extreme. And unless you really look at the text in detail, right, closely, it's not often talked about. It's not often really mulled over. Does it benefit you to defraud, to despise the toil of your hands while smiling on the counsel of the wicked? You have the eyes of flesh that you seek my iniquity and search out my sin. You know that I'm not guilty and that there is none to deliver from your hand. Right? Blaming God, right? This is unfair. You are both the judge and the prosecutor. Your hands shaped and fashioned me, then destroyed every part of me. Is it something to be proud of to hunt me like a lion? Right? And here in blue, we see the positive emotions that are attributed to God as a result of his inflicting pain on Job. Right, which leads to the intimation, right, insinuation of sadism. He pours disgrace upon great men. He exalts nations, then destroys them. He deranges the leaders of the people, right, almost implying Saul, right, who was driven mad over the fact that David was chosen at the same time that Saul thought that he was the chosen king, right, and Samuel anoints David, right, in the midst of Saul's reign, and Saul goes out of his mind, right. And then in a really, really important line, which sort of encapsulates Jewish tradition, again, going back to the ideas at the core of Jewish civilization itself, Job says, I insist on arguing with God. Right? I insist on arguing with God. And remember, he's approved of in the end, right? God absolves him of all guilt. In fact, God blames Job's friends who attributed many reasons to Job's punishment, saying, well, Job must have done something without realizing it to incur such punishment from God, right? God has his reasons, right? They presume to know God's reasoning, which was not acceptable according to God. But he does approve of Job in the end, because Job admits that he does not understand God's justice, God's logic, that it is beyond him, right? And so therefore we come to the conclusion and the understanding that insisting on arguing with God, right? Arguing with God, even accusing God of injustice or of abuse of power or of sadism is not blaspheming. It's not sin. It's not disapproved of in Jewish tradition. This is how far Jewish tradition can go. That within faith itself, right? It's acceptable to question. It's almost necessary to question. Right? Only by questioning do we actually come to an understanding, do we actually reveal our own incapacity to understand. Because if we understood God or felt that we understood God, we would have no reason to keep questioning, right? And Job cannot conceive of a world, no ancient Jew could have, and no religious Jew can conceive of a world without God in it, right? So even if you don't understand why you're suffering, right? Never once would you, as an ancient Jew or religious Jew, relinquish the belief in God. There is no universe without God. But what you can do is you can argue with him and question and struggle with him. And even the word Israel, right? Isra means to struggle, right? And then Jacob struggled with the angel and received the name Israel. So very much, even in the name of the nation itself, is this encapsulation of an idea of struggle as inherent to faith, as inherent to existence itself, that, faith is not a destination in Jewish tradition. It is by no means a destination. It is a journey. And you have to get to the precipice of disbelief in order to come back to the understanding, to a stronger understanding, to a stronger faith, right? It's almost like iron going through the fire, through the crucible of fire, in order to become stronger in the end. And as painful as the process is, it's necessary, and there is no true faith really without it. So going back to Job, why do you hide your face and treat me like an enemy? Will you harass a driven leaf? Will you pursue dried up straw? So you destroy man's hope, you overpower him forever, and he perishes. Right? This is so depressing on one hand, and people ask it all the time when we cover this in Introduction to Jewish Civilization, how in the world could such a text inspire faith, right? And it's because in the end, really, Job is approved of, and he passes the test, and God returns to him everything that he had lost before, which is just incredible, and the modern sensibility can't wrap its mind around this, right? How can you receive your sons back? He received more sons and more wealth and more daughters than he ever had before. And if we just think about it for a minute as time reversal, it helps. It's as if God reversed time and gave Job back everything that he had lost and said, to you, you are my righteous servant. And he won the bet with the adversary, God did, because Job proved that he accepted that he could not understand God's logic, that we don't understand the big plan. And therefore, innocent suffering, right, seems to us unjust, but that's because we don't understand the larger plan. We're not privy to the divine intellect. So interpretations of Job are very, very wide, right? Classical interpretations make an Adam-Job parallel, right? Maimonides believed that the theme of knowledge is key, and it really is. Job learns that his purpose, that God's purpose is unknowable, right? And that you don't attribute, reasons for suffering to either the sufferer or God, because either way, you're going to distort either the sufferer or God, misunderstand them, right? The main thing is to understand that you don't understand, that you don't understand your life, that you don't understand the meaning of suffering in your life. And classical Talmudic Midrashic interpreters compare him to Abraham. They avoid references to the extremes of Job's rebellion. They present God as more concerned about Job and his creatures. And protest is turned into an affirmation of faith, essentially. The main thing is that Job in all his agony does not abandon faith, that God will be his salvation. Deep down, and Martin Buber even talks about this, that there's this paradox, right, between that is in every deep thinker's mind who really questions the situation of Job, right? There's a paradox and an impossibility to reconcile innocent suffering with the idea of a benevolent entity, a benevolent deity, right? But deep down, Martin Buber says, Job actually never truly doubts God's benevolence. He's only confused as to its evidence in the world, right? So there's doubt and error, but not necessarily rebellion. This is interesting to probe, right? Is that true? Mark Larimore in the Book of Job, a biography, says that there are 4 assumptions of ancient interpreters, that the Bible is cryptic and allegorical, that it's a book of lessons and instructions directed to contemporary readers. It contains no contradictions or mistakes. It's a divinely given text. And Job's questions about justice, God's justice, are obscured, right? Nachum Glatzer talks about a universal moral code, and how the book of Job is intended to indicate the universal character of the issues of suffering and evil and man confronting God in the world, right? This is a revolutionary text because it's talking about humankind in general, not just about the Jews. Its hero is man suffering everywhere, right? Like Adam and the fall. And the radical nature of Job's protest cannot be overemphasized, says Glatzer. Job blames God for destroying, oppressing, and despising the innocent, himself foremost. From God comes destruction, not creation. The existence of God does not imply his concern and benevolence. And key words are knowledge, wisdom, and understanding, right? But we see that in the end, Job actually passes the test, right? Suffering is not always deserved. That's what he understands, right? Unlike his friends who says suffering is always deserved. You just have to figure out where you went wrong. God always has a reason, right? If you insist that it always is deserved, then you're falsifying either the sufferer or God or both, which is another lesson taken away from the book of Job. And of course, the final one is you cannot understand the reasons for suffering. Now, just as a side point, because I know I'm probably running out of time, Shalom Aleichem, who's a famous Yiddish writer and sort of one of the founders of modern Jewish literature in Hebrew and Yiddish, wrote a book called Tevye the Dairyman, on which basis the musical Fiddler on the Roof was created in 1964 and later turned into the well-known and beloved film in 1971. And his works sort of focus on the disintegration of the Eastern European shtetl, the hamlet or village in Eastern Europe, and the traditional Jewish life in the years leading up to World War I. And in his chapter, Sprinze, within Tevye the Dairyman, which was written in 1904, and these stills are taken from a different movie, from Tevye, a movie called Tevye, which was filmed in 1939, which is very worth seeing, and we see it in the class I teach. There is a character, Tevye, and his daughter, Sprinze. And without going into it too much, I will just say that this chapter draws directly on Job, right? Which Shalom Aleichem readers are intimately familiar with. And in it, Tevye argues with God, right? And as such, this comes from the Hillel Halkin's introduction to Tevye. He says, Tevye, as a God arguer, belongs in a long Jewish tradition that starts out with Abraham and runs prominently on through Moses, through Job and Jeremiah, and through some rabbis, one of whom, Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev, held a trial at which the absent God was the absentee defendant. Right? Again, going back to interpretation and questioning at the core of Jewish civilization. Hillel Halkin says, other religions may have their folk tales about men who debate with and even rebuke God, but only in Jewish tradition, I believe, are such stories taken with high seriousness and the behavior in question regarded as the highest form of religious service. Just so we understand, going back to Yom Kippur, the idea of self-questioning, right? This is the highest form of religious service, right? We are questioning ourselves, not necessarily the text or God on Yom Kippur, but we are engaging in a foundational principle at the core of Jewish civilization. From the end of the book of Job, where Job, according to God, has spoken what was right, one may conclude that what is right, apparently, is to hold God to the highest standards of a man's conscience, even if he does not seem to behave by them. Or perhaps, and this I amended, that questioning is an acceptable part of the journey to faith. Right? And standard responses by cultures to the problem of innocent suffering, Hillel Halkin says, is that God exists, is good, and is all-powerful. What appears to us is his injustice is either legitimate testing of our character, a just retribution for our sins, an illusion created by our inability to understand the divine. This is the traditional classic ancient and rabbinic view of Judaism. A second view is that God exists, is good, but is not all-powerful. Beside him are other evil forces that contend with and sometimes best him. There are aspects of this. This is Gnosticism, and there are aspects of this in Christianity. There's another view, God does not exist, and suffering is the result either of blind chance or of immutable laws working themselves out in man's life. This is the secular viewpoint. And then there's a fourth viewpoint that Halkin says is that God exists. He is good. He is all-powerful. Therefore, he must be just, but he is not just. Therefore, he owes man an explanation, and man must demand it from him, right? Employing Talmudic reasoning and logic and thinking and phraseology to this religious view. This is the biblical Job's response, essentially, but it's also Tevye's, right? He's demanding an explanation from God. Why is this happening to me, right? He loses his daughter Sprinze, who drowns herself. And he's questioning why should God single him out, right? Why is this happening to him? But then, of course, Tevye goes back on himself, and he says, with my problem was not with God. With God, I had somehow made my peace, right? My problem was with people. Why are they so bad when they could just as well have been good, right? And he tries to understand his suffering as the result of human actions and not necessarily come from God. So it does adapt the story of Job. It's worth reading. So with that, I'll sort of begin to wrap up. I just want to say that I hope that as we go through this process of self-reckoning and tshuva, returning to a path we've strayed from, asking ourselves questions, how have we behaved in the last year, right? That how can we become better people, right? That we that we remember that self-questioning, right, is at the very core and the very heart of Jewish civilization itself, of Jewish history, of Jewish tradition, of the Hebrew Bible, of our people's, right, of the Jewish people's legacy, essentially, is the act of interpretation from the Bible itself to Talmudic interpretation and the interpretation that is a part naturally of Yom Kippur itself. So understand that what you're doing is part of a much larger tradition, a very ancient one, a very deep one, a very unique one, I think, and a very rich one, very relatively liberal one as well. Okay, so I hope you have a tzom kal, right, a light fast, and gemar chatima tova. Okay, take care, everybody.
Our warmest greetings to our sisters and brothers of the Jewish community here at Georgetown University, and to all your loved ones both at home and abroad throughout the world as you enter into these beautiful and sacred observations of the High Holy Days. I'm Lisa Director Davis, and I'm the Program Director for the John Main Center for Meditation and Interreligious Dialogue. And we send our belated Shana Tova for Rosh Hashanah last week, and our thoughts are with you for a reflective, easy, and meaningful fast for Yom Kippur. This past year has been a tremendous time of upheaval. So I hope this sacred celebration and observation of the new year can mark a turning point for you and for your community, one that is of restoration, of renewal, and yet incredible potential for healing and transformation. Each day at the John Main Center, we offer the opportunity for deeper reflection with others through the practice of silent group meditation. And the three pillars of this practice are stillness, silence, and simplicity. All of our dramatic external conflicts that are whirling all around us and all the interpersonal strife may feel like the experience of stillness is the furthest thing from you. Yet every time I have the opportunity to sit down and meditate with others, I'm reminded of the passage in 1 Kings, which reveals that in the midst of the great calamities, God spoke and continues to speak gently in a still, small voice. So our hope for you today and for the year to come is that you will find creative ways to make space in your daily lives for still, silent, and simple moments where you can incline the ear of your heart and hear the divine, still, small voice within you, within your relationships, and within your community. And may this voice be a shepherding voice that continually calls you back to be restored, to be renewed, to be gathered, and to be loved, but also a prophetic voice to be compassionate stewards of forgiveness, of healing, and of transformation, all of which this world needs so much of now. So many, many blessings to you, and abundant peace in your reflection and year ahead. Peace be with you.
Shana Tova. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Jonathan Ray, and I teach Jewish Studies here at Georgetown. The high holidays have always been an opportunity to take a moment to consider the past year as we ready ourselves to begin anew. This past year has been particularly challenging for a number of reasons, most notably due to the COVID-19 pandemic in which we still find ourselves. So as a Jewish historian, I thought it might be timely and perhaps even helpful to share a few points with you today on the role that the pandemic has played in Jewish history. Although it might be odd to think of it in quite this way, plagues have always had a special place in Jewish culture. Various forms of plague and potentially contagious diseases are mentioned throughout the Torah, including the 10 plagues that God set upon Egypt that we all recall every year at the Passover Seder. But in fact, the presence of plague and pandemics have shaped Jewish history far beyond the Torah and our holidays. And unfortunately, one of the most significant ways in which the plague and pandemics have influenced Jewish history is through the popular characterization of Jews as the causes of disease. While Jewish accounts of the 10 plagues visited upon Egypt portray them as divine punishment for Egyptian enslavement of the Israelites, other interpretations of the Exodus circulated throughout the ancient world. In fact, some Egyptian chroniclers blamed the plagues on the Israelites themselves, saying that the impurity that they brought into Egypt was the cause for their expulsion by the Egyptians. This notion that the Egyptians saved themselves from plague only by expelling the Israelites was later picked up by Roman historians such as Tacitus, whose famous history of the ancient world would exert a huge influence on popular thinking about the Jews for centuries. In the Middle Ages, a fear of the Jews as outsiders whose mere presence was an affront to God, combined with mutual mistrust between Jews and Christians, as the Jews were seen as potential enemies of the Christian community. While these ideas were by no means universal, they were sufficiently widespread that Jews regularly saw themselves as targets of abuse during times of natural disaster and social unrest. And no event in the medieval world sowed fear and panic more than the outbreak of the bubonic plague, which ravaged Europe and the Middle East in the mid-14th century. The Black Death, as it is known, was one of the worst pandemics in human history, and a huge portion of the medieval population succumbed to the disease. There was no known cure for the Black Death, and very little understanding of how exactly it was spread. Many saw the terrible toll of the disease to be proof that God was punishing humanity for any number of sins, from gambling and swearing to prostitution, witchcraft, and even interfaith sex. Others feared human agency, that is, that the Jews were poisoning the wells. In several regions, long-standing mistrust of Jews boiled over in the midst of the panic caused by the plague, and whole Jewish communities were attacked and destroyed. Large bands of flagellants roamed from town to town, scourging their own flesh in an effort to appease God and end the pandemic, and they often demanded that the Jews pay an even higher price. Many Christian leaders acknowledged the Jews' innocence and sought to protect them, but they were unable to restrain the mob. Rumors and fears in this case defeated the best efforts of the Pope and the protective actions of secular lords. Fear and confusion also shaped Jewish responses to the plague at this time. Contemporary Jews, much like their Christian and Muslim counterparts, saw the Black Death as divine punishment for their sins, and most Jewish authors who wrote on the plague, including Jewish physicians, did not seem to think of it as a contagion. Some Jews were also quick to take advantage of the chaos caused by the Black Death. In many communities, the richer and more powerful families declared that such desperate times called for autocratic rule, and used the situation as an excuse to assert their own authority over the rest of the community. But we also learn that such violent and sinister reactions did not always accompany large outbreaks of disease. When the plague returned to Europe in the 15th century, there was no attack on the Jews. As a matter of fact, local Jewish groups marched alongside Christians in processions meant to ward off the plague. This contrast between the reactions to the plague in the 14th and 15th centuries is worth noting. It seems that the difference hinged on effective leadership and the government's ability to uphold law and order. When the mob ruled, the flagellants burned and attacked Jews. But when civic and religious institutions held sway, order was maintained and Jews were included in public policies in order to protect the spread of the disease, against the spread of the disease, rather than being targeted as its cause. It was during one such outbreak of the plague in the 15th century that Rabbi Elijah Kapsali wrote one of the first great histories of the Ottoman Empire and the Jews therein as a way to pass the time during quarantine. He begged his readers to excuse him for turning to profane histories rather than dedicating himself to more pious activity, explaining that studying Talmud and other sacred texts required too much concentration. Kapsali wrote that he, like so many at the time, were too preoccupied with what might become of them to focus on serious intellectual activity. Every day, he writes, we say, what will be our end? Now, as an historian, I bristle a little at the notion that writing and reading history is little more than a pastime and not a serious intellectual work. But his point is otherwise well taken. Many of us today feel like we are in a holding pattern in our lives, finding it difficult to focus our attention on anything serious for too long. And there are other Jewish responses to pandemics that seem familiar to us today. In the 1570s, the plague erupted once again, this time in Venice, where roughly 1/3 of the city died within 2 years. At this point, local Jews had come to understand that the disease was indeed a contagion and were heartbroken that they were unable to attend the sick and the dying for fear of transmitting the disease. Still, as soon as the Jewish leaders allowed, they formed volunteer confraternities known as the Gemilut Hasadim Society, aimed at caring for the victims and their families. The Jews of Venice became models of prompt and careful responses to pandemics. Jewish and Christian observers alike noted that the Jews were quick to take their children to doctors, often more so than many of their neighbors, especially among the Jewish poor. Episodes of plague returned again and again throughout history, particularly in port cities that were infamous for transmitting infectious diseases. In 1892, an outbreak of typhus aboard a ship carrying Russian Jews to New York City led to the forced quarantine of all Russian Jews arriving in New York City, but not other immigrant groups. This practice of quarantine by ethnicity, rather than by proof of infection, drew loud protests from the Yiddish press, but to little avail. The typhus outbreak was quickly followed by another epidemic, this time of cholera, which produced much of the same backlash against Jewish immigrants. A New York Times article from this period warned against the role of Jews in the spread of infectious diseases. It noted, quote, "These people were offensive enough even at the best of times. Under present circumstances, they are a positive menace to the health of the country. Cholera, it must be remembered, originates in the homes of the riffraff," end quote. If anti-Jewish views in the Middle Ages argue that Christian deaths must have been from Jewish plots, those in the modern period argue that Jews were carriers of the plague due to their inferior bodies and weak moral character. Jewish physicians and amateur anthropologists fought back against such theories with medical and social scientific studies. Jewish researchers such as Dr. Maurice Fishberg argue that if diseases like cholera, tuberculosis, and typhus were rampant among Russian Jews, it was because they were forced to live in impoverished conditions where poor sanitation, poor nutrition, and contaminated drinking water were common. Sadly, not all Jews were so quick to come to the defense of their beleaguered brethren. Many wealthy and well-established Jews who were first and second generation Americans shared their neighbors' fears with regard to the recent Russian Jewish immigrants. In many cases, the so-called uptown Jews were more concerned with the damage that these newer immigrants might do to their reputation than with the public health crisis in poorer Jewish communities that contributed to the spread of these infectious diseases. As many of the leading Jewish men of this period remained focused on their community's reputation, Jewish women stepped in to address the underlying problems in these pandemics. In the wake of the epidemics of 1892, a Jewish nurse by the name of Lillian Wald began to visit poor Jewish communities on the Lower East Side, offering classes on hygiene and basic medical care. Wald later founded the Henry Street Settlement, a pioneering institution in public health directed toward poor women and children, which later developed into the Visiting Nurse Service of New York. Wald, and the famous Wald nurses that they employed, sought to remove the underlying causes of pandemics through a series of classes and through charity. Other Jewish philanthropies arose at this time, seeking to take care of their sick and dying, as Jewish confraternities or chevrot had once done. They provided kosher food, religious services, and social support for the sick in times of crisis. These various communal responses to pandemics of the late 19th century and to the anti-Jewish attitudes they provoked helped establish a foundation for American Jewry to confront the terrible influenza outbreak of 1918. During this pandemic, New York's popular Jewish language newspaper, the Jewish Daily Forward, became a major source of information about the disease, explaining its causes and giving news of its transmission throughout its Jewish readership. The Forward regularly published advice on how to best prevent the spread of the disease. It warned its readers not to share drinking cups or share pipes, not to let their children play with each other's toys, and when using public telephones, to be sure to keep their mouths far from the receiver. Religious authorities, such as the New York-based dean, also stepped in to help to contain the disease, relaxing halakhic requirements such as the laws regarding mourning. Whereas mourners were traditionally expected to stay at home, not bathe or change clothes, the base dean encouraged those who were sitting Shiva to get fresh air for several hours a day, not to go barefoot, and to otherwise put their health first. As we all continue to make our way through this current pandemic as best we can, it might be helpful to bear in mind some of these lessons from Jewish history. Debates about which sector of society is most responsible for the pandemic and which other sector is most exposed, and what we can do about this continue to resonate with us today. Jews have been the underclass before and have been victims of prejudice and xenophobia. We have been at the forefront of responsible journalism, social scientific studies, and careful medical responses to the plagues. We have also come together to aid and comfort one another during times of epidemics and to cure ourselves also of the violence that these epidemics can cause. Sadly, however, at the same time, Jews have also given into fear and uncertainty bred by these crises. Hopefully, we can get through our current pandemic by drawing strength from our long history and become a source of help and understanding for each other and for those around us. I wish you all health, peace, and patience in the coming year. Gemar Tov.
Dear sisters and brothers of the Jewish community here at Georgetown University, I want to congratulate you on the new year, Shana Tova. I wish you a great year, a wonderful year, a successful year, and a peaceful year. I know this has been a tough time for all of us, and I'm sure this coming year wouldn't be easy here at Georgetown University. But with the new year comes a new hope. With the new year comes a new reality, comes a new dream. With the new year, with the new hope, with a new reality, come so many possibilities. And that is what I really wish for you. A year filled with positive possibilities, with much peace and success in your studies here at Georgetown University and in your dreams beyond the Healy Gates. My wonderful friends, Jews, Christians, and Muslims are sisters and brothers. Not only Jews, Christians, and Muslims, people of so many faiths and traditions around the world come together to celebrate God, to celebrate one another, to celebrate the family of humanity. In Islam, we talk about Musa alayhi salam, upon him be peace, Moses. We speak about the tradition of Moses, what Moses had to face in Egypt and out of Egypt, when God was there with him in the river before he was picked up by Pharaoh and his soldiers, when he grew up in the castle and the house of Pharaoh. After that, and when God opened and split the sea for him out of Egypt. My friends, we are mishbacha echad. We are one family. Not only the family of Abraham, but also the family of Isaac, the family of Ishmael, the family of Hagar, and the family of Sarah. We are the family of Moses and the family of Muhammad. We all claim the love of God. We all claim the love of justice. We all claim the love of Abraham. We all claim that we are here on this earth because God wanted us here to do justice, to pursue peace, and to become a voice for those who have no voice. And I believe that this could be another year during which we coordinate our efforts to make peace possible here in Washington, D.C., here in America and around the world. I'm here for you, and I know that you'll be there for me, my sisters and my brothers. Mishbacha echad, And I say, Shalom Aleinu, may the peace be upon all of us, may the peace be upon you, may the peace be upon the entire family of humanity. I wish you the best. Dream big, think big, become big. But guess what? We're big together, with each other, and for each other. Shabbat, Shalom, and Shana Tova, and may your lives always be Tov and good and filled with peace. Imam Yahya Hindi, Director of Muslim Life here at Georgetown University. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Hello. I hope that those of you who are fasting are having an easy fast. I've been thinking a lot recently about whether or not Zoom services and the virtual world will make fasting easier or harder, and we're learning in the moment right now. So I hope those of you that are fasting are having an easy fast. And if you are not fasting, good Yontif, Yom Tov. I hope today is meaningful for you. My name is Rachel Faulkner. I am the National Jews of Color Organizer at Dimensions Educational Consulting, and I am based in DC, so in community with many of you. I identify as a Black Jew, and so I'm really excited to be here today, observing with you all and living at that intersection. And before I jump into all of the things I want to say today, I think when people hear that someone is a Black Jew or lives at an intersection like Blackness and Judaism, there is a almost like instinctual, like, oh no, or an almost instinctual, like, I can't imagine what living at that intersection is like. And so before I jump into some of the oh no's that are caused by living at that intersection, I want to talk about the beauty that has been this year living at the intersection of Blackness and Judaism. One of the things that's really exciting to me, actually, that happened this year is that Black Jews became a thing because Tiffany Haddish came out, so to speak, as a Black Jew, and had this like amazing bat mitzvah that I tweeted and Instagram hashtagged and emailed and Facebook messaged her every day for weeks to try to attend, but I'm not bitter about not having an invitation. I am excited about the idea that there's representation, because representation matters. And I think Tiffany Haddish exploring her Judaism for us all to see really added to the representation of Black Jews in the world. As a result of COVID, actually, in my role, I got to start hosting every 6 weeks community calls for Jews of color, and those community calls are beautiful, and they are the world that I wish that we all lived in, and the space that I wish all Black Jews and Jews of color had. They are prayerful, they are joyful, they are full of music, and I don't think that we would have had that had COVID not happened. And the other thing that happened this year that I'm really excited about is I think this year a lot of organizations that are led and serve Jews of color came together to do work that will sort of go down in history. One of those projects was actually a fundraiser that we did over Hanukkah, where 7 organizations that are led by and serving Jews of color came together to just show the world that we can get resourced and that we can do our work on our own, and that we don't necessarily need like these big foundations to make the work that we do possible and to support our work. And I start there knowing that this year was hard for all of us, that this year came with a lot of injustice, with a lot of death, with a lot of pain, with a lot of trauma. And I want to make sure that we also name that. And I think as a Black Jew, there were things that happened this year that caused particular pain and trauma for the community of Black Jews. You know, the Muncie attack over Hanukkah actually happened at the same time as our fundraiser. The Jersey City attack, I think impacted Black Jews differently than other communities. I think many of us, including Black Jews, were still reeling from the anti-Semitic violence at Tree of Life. That wasn't even this year. And I think one of the things that was particularly painful for me after all of those events, and particularly Muncie and Jersey City, where the perpetrators of the violence were Black, was the way in which we let white supremacy divide communities that are already marginalized. What disappointed me was the way in which there became a Blacks versus Jews, where there became a question of why Blackness, why anti-Semitism shows up in Black communities in a different way or more than in any other community. And those questions are unfair and they're painful and they cause real trauma, to be honest. And so this year has been remarkable in many ways and really devastating in other ways, living and waking up every day in my Black and Jewish body. And I think one of the things that is sort of a theme throughout all of those things is how white Jews name or grapple with anti-Semitism as part of white supremacy, and also show up for other communities that are marginalized and murdered by white supremacy. And I think there's no other example or no more dominant or prominent example of that than the way COVID has shown up in our world. COVID obviously disproportionately impacts communities of color and Black communities specifically. I think we talk about that normally when we talk about specifically the amount of death that the Black community has experienced, but I want to make sure that we also talk about the way that COVID has exacerbated the ways in which Black folks are oppressed in America already, and the oppression Black folks were experiencing before COVID. Already Black children were disproportionately going to failing schools. That's been exacerbated by COVID. Already Black folks had a disproportionate access to medicine and medical care. That has been exacerbated by COVID. Already Black folks were experiencing mass incarceration and the disassembling of Black families. That has been exacerbated by COVID. Already Black communities were over-policed and underprotected in our world and in our country, and stay-at-home orders only exacerbate that over-policing. Already we were seeing a criminalization of homelessness. How do you obey a stay-at-home order when you don't have a home to stay in? And that's not even to talk about the joblessness and the disproportionate impact on families and communities already experiencing poverty, and what COVID has done for that. And again, that's all on top of the COVID impact is all on top of the disproportionate impact that white supremacy has had on Black folks already. So the question that I want to really grapple with as I speak to you today is how we can acknowledge, name, and talk about the harm and trauma that anti-Semitism has caused as part of a larger system of white supremacy that is disproportionately impacting Black folks and folks of color in our country and in our world. And one of the things that we often do on Yom Kippur is name those that we have lost in community and in our circles. And one of the things that I think it's important to pause as we talk about those who have died this year and the disproportionate impact of COVID on those deaths is talk about the folks that have been left nameless. Some of the folks that have been left nameless are the Black bodies that have been murdered by over-policing that we don't hear. Deon Kay, for example, who was killed in DC in our own neighborhood. Stephen Taylor, Nicholas Chavez, Dijon Kinsey, Trayford Pellerin. All of those folks were murdered by police, and we don't say those names. So while we're talking about the disproportionate impact of police violence and COVID and all of these things, I want to make sure that those folks are named into the space. And there are so many nameless Black folks that have been killed by COVID, and I want to make sure that those folks are honored as well. And on Yom Kippur, we do teshuvah, right? We've been doing teshuvah for a while now. We've been reflecting, and sort of this is our big day to make sure it's all out. And we reflect and we apologize. And one of the things that I really love about this time of year is that we don't just apologize to God. We literally are commanded to go person to person and say, I'm sorry for the harm I caused you. And this has been quite the process for me this year. I have really struggled with how to name racism, especially in Jewish community, without causing harm, without causing hurt. And I'm also grappling with whether or not I should have to apologize for naming racism and that's impact on white Jews. And I say that because there are a lot of things I wish that the Jewish community would apologize for. And I actually participated in the writing this year of an al-Chet for the Jewish community. And I want to read that for y'all if you'll give me the moment. And I want to say before I start that there are 44 sins in this 1,100-year-old piece. More than half of those focus on speech or thought rather than action. And I think that this is a particularly important note when we talk about white supremacy, because we often think about white supremacy only as action, but I actually think it is implicit bias and the things that we think about before we act or don't think about before we act that causes many of the racist interactions and the racist policies, et cetera, that we all live under. And so the al-Chet goes like this. Al-Chet shachatanu lefanecha, for the sins we have committed, by believing that what benefits us personally is a universal benefit without harm to others, and by believing that whatever doesn't benefit us or interest us is unimportant. By believing that whatever is not a problem for us is personally not in need of attention, and by believing that what ails us is a universal problem in need of immediate attention. By expecting Jewish perspectives to be understood in spaces we often avoid and rarely engage in, and by treating Black Lives Matter as optional concerns for Jews and Jewish institutions. By prioritizing predominantly white Jewish communities' concerns, and by believing that even in Black liberation work, white people are entitled to lead and direct. By taking good and bad neighborhoods for granted and expecting that we as Jews get to live in a good one, and by accepting as given the disparities between our good neighborhood and the bad one just across the river or the train tracks. By participating in and benefiting from the displacement of Black residents and culture, and by enjoying that Black culture without supporting the Black individuals and communities that created it. By failing to notice and respond in the face of daily mundane bigotry and bias, and by responding in ways that make us feel good but don't make the targeted person safer. By failing to examine our explicit and implicit biases, and by failing to recognize the pain of constant exposure to bias. Va'u kulam Elohecha slichot salach lanu mechal lanu kaper lanu. For all these sins, forgiving God, forgive us, pardon us, grant us atonement. Al-Chet shachatanu lefanecha, for the sins we have committed, by allowing anti-Semitic to be deployed as a weapon in some cases and not in others, and by allowing anti-Semitism to go unchecked in the name of coalition or solidarity. By missing how phrases like "we are all immigrants" erases indigenous and formerly enslaved people, and by separating immigration, policing, and bigotry towards Black people and brown people. By refusing to acknowledge privilege in our health and our healthcare, in our wealth, in our education, and by accepting the narrative that attributes success to just the right choices and hard work. By opting to protect our family and businesses without regard to those who lack those choices, and by discontinuing the struggles of people who don't face the same options as we do. By relying for safety on systems, including police, courts, and jails that don't protect us all, and by critiquing others' participation in systems that are not at liberty to ignore. By failing to grapple with white supremacist policy and law, economy, and other structures, and by failing to learn and honor the history of resistance and anti-racism, by equating hurt feelings and political discussion with death, injury, harassment by the state, and by dismissing the impact of dehumanizing language and images. For these sins we have committed, by citing involvement in the civil rights movement as a universal among Jews, and by taking credit for actions Jews did in decades past without acting ourselves today. By honoring Rabbi Heschel's image, but not his battle with the evil of indifference, and by still lacking a sense of monstrosity of inequality and the blasphemy of racism. By claiming my feet were praying, like Heschel did at Selma, without regard to the context, and by failing to emulate Heschel's pre-Selma activism and relationship with Black leaders. By limiting our social justice engagement to quoting Dr. Martin Luther King, but not quoting Malcolm X. By equating white protesters' voluntary risk with systemic threats to Black and brown people, and by dividing protesters into good and bad based on their treatment of property. By thinking that we're already progressive or woke enough to deserve a break or to rest, and by thinking we have the answers and can somehow fix it all. For all these sins, forgiving God, forgive us, pardon us, grant us atonement. And so those are the things that I want the Jewish community to apologize for. But I want to know that as we apologize for things that we've done this year, what we're going to do differently this year. And I can only talk about what I want the Jewish community to do differently this year. One of the things I want the Jewish community to do is to assume that I'm Jewish when I enter space. I would like to volunteer to be on the synagogue board or the racial justice task force or speak at your next Shabbat and not just be asked because of my identities or the way in which I talk about racial justice. I would like for my daughter, who's only 7 months old, to know the sound of the shofar and see the glisten of the Shabbat candles and taste the challah without experiencing a feeling of being different. I want rabbis who support my life cycle events to understand the trauma that lives in my body as a result of my Blackness. I want to enter Jewish physical spaces without worrying about police and police barriers. And I want for sacred spaces for Jews of color to exist. And there are ways in which white supremacy has caused me too to do teshuvah this year. You know, I'm not just saying all these words and demanding an apology from the broader Jewish community without acknowledging that I have my own apologies to do as well. I am doing teshuvah this year for allowing white supremacy to create conflict between myself and other Black people and allowing that conflict to exist without naming white supremacy being at its roots. I want to do teshuvah for allowing white supremacy to lower my expectations for myself and for others and not showing up in community the way I'd like as a result of that. I want to do teshuvah for allowing white supremacy to cause me to work beyond my limits and thus not do my best. I am doing teshuvah for white supremacy causing me to automatically mistrust and thus put up a wall in potential relationship. And I'm doing teshuvah for allowing white supremacy to cause me to be quick to anger, quick to judge, and slow to be willing to share, to teach, or explain, even in moments when I wanted to. So every year, all of us, all Jews of all racial backgrounds, should be doing teshuvah for the ways in which white supremacy shows up in us all, in our actions, in our thoughts and behavior, and just physically in our bodies. And while we all have teshuvah to do, I want to be clear that white Jews have a responsibility here, a responsibility that goes back at least to Maimonides. Maimonides said thousands of years ago that a Black person is incapable of obtaining a level of spiritual vigor than other folks, and that Black people are akin to animals. And I just bring that up to say that just like the rest of our world, in many ways, Judaism has been influenced by white supremacy. And just like white supremacy showed up for Rambam, it shows up for us. Because my theory is that the reason why Rambam was so quick to say these things is that even though he grew up in in Spain and then spent time in Morocco and Egypt, he was not in community with Black folks, and he was especially not in community with Black Jews. And neither are many of you, to be honest. And this 1,000-year issue of the way that we sit in our silos still plagues Jews today, and still plagues all white folks today, and all folks today. So what I want you to do in 5781 is get in relationship. I want you to get in relationship with Black folks. I want you to get in relationship with Black Jews. I want you to get in relationship with folks where there is difference. And I want you to talk, and I want you to share, and I want you to be in solidarity. And it will be tough, and it will be messy. And next year, you might, around this time, you might be apologizing for harm you caused in those relationships. But the system of white supremacy is made up of the people in it. And it is only dismantled one relationship at a time. The system of white supremacy is made up of the people in it, and it is only dismantled one relationship at a time. May all of you be inscribed in the book of life this year.
Hi, I'm Michael Goldman, the Jewish chaplain for Georgetown Law and Medical Centers. And I want to join all in wishing you and yours a sweet, healthy, and rewarding 5781. I'd like to briefly consider the role of the shofar and of forgiveness during these high holidays. One of the things the shofar does, according to our tradition, is calls God to rise up from the seat of justice and to walk over to the seat of mercy. Obviously, the kind of sympathetic judge we would all like to decide how our next year will go. So what are the values or criteria for the judge of mercy? They're 13, and they're stated throughout the high holiday services. It goes, Adonai, compassionate before a person sins. Adonai, compassionate after a person has sinned. El, mighty in compassion. Rahum, merciful, that humankind may not be distressed. Chanun, gracious, if humankind is already in distress. Erech apayim, slow to anger. Barav chesed, with an abundance of kindness and love. Ve'emet, and truth. Lotzer chesed la'alafim, keeping kindness to the 1,000 generation. No say avon, forgiving iniquity, vafesha, and transgression, vachata, and sin, vanakech, and pardoning. So I think that describes comprehensively what it means to be merciful and forgiving. Now, I'd ask you to judge those close to you on the scale of justice, not mercy, justice. How have they wronged or offended you or others? Have they been rude, curt, unthinking, callous, or mean, or all of the above? They could definitely have done better at times, I'm sure. Now, cue the shofar. Imagine a shofar blast, tekiah. I'd like you now to move to the seat of compassion and forgiveness. Compassion before they offended you and compassion after they offended you. Kindness, graciousness, slowness to anger, quickness to forgive, and yes, with abundance of love. Based on these criteria, could you now forgive them? The tradition gives us these standards to aspire to. If we're actually made in God's image, can we expect God to forgive us if we cannot begin to forgive others? We are, after all, God's representatives here. There is a connection between our kindness and compassion and God's. So try it out. Who can you forgive who wronged you last year, or others against whom you still bear a grudge? Can you imagine that they too have issues that may have compelled them to act badly? They were rushing to the hospital or for a critical meeting when they cut you off. They had a big fight at home with their teenager before they treated you poorly. They just can't face their shortcomings. Sometimes they just can't help themselves. Can you forgive them nevertheless? Take a couple of deep breaths. Inhale deeply and release. Again, inhale deeply and release. And if you're comfortable, close your eyes and focus. Continue to focus on your normal breathing. Now, imagine who hurt you last year. Just picture them, or whenever. Can you picture them? I'd like you to try to imagine them asking for your forgiveness for what they did. This may be difficult, but try to imagine it. That they sincerely, genuinely regret what they did. Using all the compassion and kindness and graciousness you can muster, can you forgive them? I'll give you a few seconds to contemplate this. Can you imagine saying you forgive them? It's clearly not so easy. But if you expect God to forgive you, wouldn't you want some slack too? You can open your eyes if you close them. I wish you all that you are forgiven by God and humans and are written and sealed for a good, sweet, and healthy new year.